to study the proposed 2012 to 2013 biennial budget for Cuyahoga County is now called to order. I would like to welcome all those who are watching on the streaming video, and those who are watching on the streaming and video do not have to turn off their cell phones and pagers, but everybody else does, so please do that at this time if your devices are on. I would now ask for the clerk to please call the roll.
Calling the roll, Mr. Gallagher.
Here.
Mr. Sean. Ms. Conwell.
Here.
Mr. Jones.
Here.
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Simon. Mr. Greenspan.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Present.
Mr. Brady.
Present.
Mr. Germana.
Here.
Ms. Conley.
Here.
There is a quorum.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. And regarding the minutes, we do the minutes on a weekly basis. So at our next meeting, we will do all the minutes from this week's meetings of the Committee of the Whole. The next item on the agenda is public comment related to the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have anybody who has signed in?
Mr. Chairman, no one has signed in to speak.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we now move on to matters referred to the committee. Madam Clerk, would you please read the resolution?
Resolution number 2011-0291, a resolution adopting the 2012-2013 biennial operating budget and capital improvements program and declaring the necessity that this resolution become immediately effective.
Thank you very much. That resolution is now before us. We are starting the first of two very important days to discuss Cuyahoga County's Health and Human Services program, and starting us off is going to be the Director of the Health and Human Services Administration, Mr. Rick Warner. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning. And you want me to go ahead and get started?
Please proceed.
Okay. I was going to say, and if my daughters are watching, please go back to school. And I was also saying, I know this is a really important day when Joe Nani and I wear a suit on the same day, so I'm going to try to play up to the appropriate standards.
Before you start, I would just like to note that Councilman Schwan has now joined the meeting, and we're just beginning the first item of testimony from our Health and Human Services Director, Rick Warner.
And members of the committee and folks in the audience, I'm working off the PowerPoint Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Health and Human Services budget presentation. You'll see as my colleagues from the various divisions within the department come up throughout the day that we've tried to put in a couple of slides sort of a summary of our organizations, what our mandates are, those items that we work on most directly. There's a little bit in some of them about structure and mission, and as well then we talk specifically about the budget. We have tried to, and I'll try to set an example, although I've had a hard time doing that in the past up here, to keep our presentations very brief so we can get to your questions. In terms of the budget book itself, the Office of Health and Human Services budget pages are Roman numeral 3. They start at Roman numeral 3-37, and in the appendix we are on page A13 in terms of our presentation. I want to thank Janet Carr, a colleague of mine in the office, and OBM and Joe Gautner for helping get us all ready for all of these presentations today. And I will say that the presentations that you will hear today from all of us in the County Human Services Department will reflect the new structure that you passed just a couple of weeks ago at the full council. So organizations that were previously independent, like Tapestry and Fatherhood, have now been folded in, thanks to your passage of the organizational ordinance, into their homes going forward. And so you will hear the budget presentations reflecting that organizational structure. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry.
Yes,
What appendix are we?
It was an appendix, Mr. Greenspan, in the budget book itself, and it lists our specific line items, contract, and it's Appendix A-13 is the page.
Thank you.
I'm going over now to the first slide that just summarizes the work of the Office of Health and Human Services. We endeavor to coordinate the work of the human service systems within the county. So all of the human service organizations that are part of the Cuyahoga County government and responsive both to the county executive for whom we work as well as the county council report up through the Office of Health and Human Services. So we assist the ongoing operation of all of the departments, although, as you will hear today, we have very competent and professional leaders within each one of the organizations to assure that we present and provide mandated services. Going over the next page, you will also see that one of the roles that the Office of Health and Human Services plays, along with Joe Gaunter as Deputy Chief of Staff for Human Services, is to provide the coordination and linkage with the other health and human service systems, both private and public, that work on human services broadly in the county. So that includes Metro Health Hospital, the Adams Board, the Board of Health, the Board of Developmental Disabilities, and one that I left off but really does need to be recognized, which is Juvenile Court. We do a great deal of work with Juvenile Court, primarily through the Department of Children and Family Services, but they are an important partner of ours in the provision of human services. What also is not reflected on this page is the large number of private nonprofits in the community that do work with us. They are sometimes funded through the county human services budget, but they also have alternative sources of funding. We also work with other funders in trying to coordinate our work, and that includes both the philanthropic community and United Way. And as the county starts its Charity Choice campaign, it's important to remember that an important component of the funding for human services in the community comes from private sources. And we try our best to work very closely with those to align the work that we're doing with the work that is done by those independent funders. Going over to page 4, you will see the funding sources rolled up for both 2012 and 2013 that are in the executive's recommended budget for the Office of Health and Human Service. And it bears a little bit of discussion about this. And so let me try to unpack this just a little bit. First of all, for 2012 and 2013, we are assigned 23 full-time equivalents, and that's divided into 3 main categories. 2 of those categories are staff who are responsive to different departments, but do all of their work on behalf of the agencies of the Health and Human Service Department. So we pay for, and there are on our budget 11 human resource staff who are accountable to Ms. Hera and her lieutenants in the Department of Human Resources. The reason that they're on the HHS payroll is because they provide service to the HHS departments exclusively. And we are able, through the use of federal and state funding, to pay for a portion of their salaries. And actually, it's a pretty significant portion. So it makes sense from a budget standpoint to have them within the Office of Health and Human Services, although, again, they are accountable to Ms. Hera and her department. Okay. So 11 of the 23 FTEs are, in fact, HR folks, and they work both directly in the departments assisting the senior management there with human resource issues. They also work in payroll processing so that we make sure that all of the issues that we need to do to make sure that we pay our staff regularly are taken care of. So 11, again, of the 23 FTEs are human resource staff. There are 2 additional FTEs who work for the Office of Procurement and Diversity. As you've seen in the agendas that have come before you, the Department of Human Services, through all of its divisions and offices, generates an enormous number of contracts. And we always appreciate the work of the Clerk of Council with helping us get those on your agendas. But even before that, the Office of Procurement and Diversity plays an enormous role in making sure that we've minded our P's and Q's, particularly under the new contracting ordinances that exist in the county. And so we pay for 2 staff who are, again, accountable to Lenora Lockett in her department, but they work exclusively on health and human service contracts. And so therefore, we have been able to pay them out of health and human service funding. The remaining 10 HHS staff are in the office that I'm in, the Office of Health and Human Services, and again, our work is primarily coordinating. We don't provide any direct service out of the Office of Health and Human Services. We are working with not only our colleagues within the county, but also, as I mentioned, the outside agencies in terms of coordinating service. If you compare our budget in terms of FTEs to past years, with the reorganization ordinance that you passed a couple of weeks ago, we did make a couple of shifts that are reflective in the 2012 budget for the first time. So there were 3 staff that were on the Health and Human Services payroll last year that have moved over to the reentry office. They have been working in reentry for quite some time, but we had not aligned their status and their FTEs as part of that office. So it's not an increase when you hear from Mr. Vasquez this afternoon on reentry. It looks as if his staff has increased by 3. What it means is we've just shifted the FTEs and the money associated with them from the Office of Health and Human Services to the Office of Reentry. We felt that this was the most transparent way of aligning it so that it was very clear to whom that staff was accountable, and it's to Mr. Vasquez in reentry. There were 2 other staff that have moved off of the Office of Health and Human Services and over to the Child Support Enforcement Agency. They are the 2 staff who work on fatherhood issues, and again, as part of the reorganization that the county executive announced in the late spring, based on the transition planning work that had gone on in 2010, we moved both staff to CISA a couple of months ago. So, and you will hear from Dr. Russ Kay when he does the presentation on child support about the work of fatherhood within that agency. You will see that for both 2012 and 2013, there's a slightly separate mix of federal and state funding as opposed to the local health and human service levy. And that reflects the work of Walter Parfiowicz, who is the senior fiscal person at the Department of Employment and Family Services, but who operates for all intents and purposes as the CFO for all of Human Services. He manages the flows of funding that we get from the state, make sure that we're using them for the appropriate purposes. And his work, along with Joe Gauntner and Jackie Ward, Joe, who used to run Employment and Family Services, have worked very hard to make sure that we maximize state funding. I mean, frankly, those are the dollars we're required to provide services that the state and feds mandate that we require. They provide as you can see, a large portion of the funding for that, and so we want to make sure that funding is not only managed appropriately, but is also maximized to the largest degree possible. We are allowed under the rules of funding from both federal and state sources to pay for or coordinating services like the office that I'm in provides. So that's why a large portion of our costs are underwritten by federal and state sources. Going over to the 5th slide, you'll see the way that our expenses are broken down for the next couple of years that comprise the biennial budget. As you will see, the main change, and frankly, I think the only change from 2012 into 2013, is the fact that the personal benefits line goes down considerably in 2013, and that reflects the fact that the county is still paying for the early retirement incentive program that was instituted by the commissioners 3 or 4 years ago, and so every year we pay a smaller portion of the costs of that early retirement incentive program, and there were a number of folks who retired from the Office of Health and Human Services, both HR staff as well as some of human service staff, and so the fall off in the number of the personal benefits line reflects the fact that our obligation to pay for those benefits goes down every year. I think it sunsets in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So the balance of the benefits then are the benefits for existing staff. And I'm happy to talk more specifically about the specific line items. You'll see in the next couple of pages are pie charts that show you the division of those expenses for 2012 and 2013. I might just say one thing about the contracts line. The Office of Health and Human Services has a relatively small, at least relative to the other parts of the human services world, contract line. We manage about 10 contracts that essentially benefit the entire Human Services Department. It didn't make sense to have those necessarily in a division of the department, and so we manage them. Some of them we are required to have in place. One is the AIDS Funding Collaborative. We provide $150,000 for that. That acts as a maintenance of effort payment for the Ryan White program that I will talk about in a minute. But again, the balance of the contracts that we have in our contract line are designed to benefit the entire department as opposed to a specific division within it. Before I go to the objectives that we hope to work on in 2012, I did want to say for just a minute, you don't see it in your budget, and that's because it's entirely federally funded, but the Ryan White HIV/AIDS treatment program is a division or a part of the Office of Health and Human Service. Lori Atkins, who's with us today, is the person in charge of Ryan White. We get almost $5 million a year from the HRSA organization, which is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. The only local payment for that pays for all the staff and all the contract work. We act as the agent for a 6-county area in northeastern Ohio. The feds requested that we do that. So we have representation on the Planning Council. I think you recently approved at your council meetings the current members of the Ryan White Planning Council, and they reflect the participation of all the counties for whom we act as agents, or for which we act as agent. And again, that funding flows directly from HRSA at the federal level to the county, and it therefore is not reflected in the executive's recommended budget because there are no local dollars in that. And if you have questions specifically about Ryan White, Ms. Atkins can certainly answer them. Going over then to the last page, and I apologize, I finished this last, so I only came up with 2 objectives. We will have more for 2012. First and foremost is the passage of the Health and Human Service Levy. Mr. Brady's committee considered the legislation putting the Health and Human Service Levy on what we think is the March ballot for next year. We obviously cannot campaign for the levy as county staff, but we do a informational campaign essentially to make sure that both our staff, you as elected officials, the county executive, and other partners in the community know about the importance of the levy to the county for the work that it's done. The levy itself, the campaign, is structured outside of the county. The levy campaign is funded entirely by resources raised by the County Action Committee, so there's no government money, if you will, or county money in the campaign itself. But the Office of Health and Human Services, primarily Mary Louise Madigan and I, are responsible for making sure that we are coordinating with the campaign to make sure that the correct message is going out from the county about the levy. Obviously, one of the reasons we have historically, and again, under the county executive's direction, put the levy on the ballot in the spring is if for some reason, and we've been very lucky in not having them fail, but if for some reason it would fail in March, and we don't expect it to, we'd have the opportunity to put it on at a subsequent election in 2012. The levy itself, which is the larger of our 2 levies, expires at the end of 2012, so we need to pass it next year. The other thing that we will be broadly working on, and although a lot of the organizational movement has occurred to put into effect the ordinance that you passed a couple of weeks ago that reorganizes or provides for the organization of the Human Services Department, there are lots of follow-on issues to make sure that those departments that have been merged or offices that have been moved into departments are smoothly coordinated, and so that will be the work, among other things, that the Office of Health and Human Services will work on in 2012. That concludes my presentation. I'm now happy to answer any questions about the budget book or what's in the recommended budget, in the appendix, or any other questions that you have for me.
Okay, we're going to go to questions, and we're going to start with the Chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee, Councilman Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the Director, good morning, Director.
Good morning.
What I'd like to have you do first, before we kind of get into the weeds here, is talk a little bit about the big picture of the Health and Human Service budget. And what I mean by that is please explain to the committee about the fact that the levy will not bring in, we do not expect the levy to bring in as much money as it has in the past. Secondly, about the balance on the levy account, and also the public assistance fund, so that as we talk about all of this, we hopefully have a big picture of what the Health and Human Services budget includes beyond what's being presented by the administration.
Okay. I will try to cover all those, and Mr. Chairman, I assume you will remind me if I miss a part of it. I'm first going to refer to page Roman numeral 2-13, which is Schedule 7 in the budget. And this is, Mr. Brady, the slide or the page that we used last week in discussing the Health and Human Service levy at your committee. This is sort of the one-page cheat sheet. Again, it's Roman numeral 2-13. It's the one-page summary of the sources and uses for all those programs that are funded by the Health and Human Service levy. So you'll see at the top of the page the two levies, the 2.9 mil levy, the smaller of the two levies that was approved by voters in 2010, and you see the 4.8 mil levy that is the subject of next year's campaign in the second line. Mr. Brady is correct that when we passed the 4.8 mil levy, and it was passed in 2008, we expected, if you look back to like 2009, the 2009 column, we expected it to generate close to, or it did generate in 2009, I should say, $156 million. As a result of the economic climate within Cuyahoga County, as well as actions at the state level that have reduced the tangible personal, or the commercial activity tax and the tangible personal property tax, we are collecting less on actually both levies, but in particular the one that Mr. Brady mentioned that is up for renewal next year, the 4.8 mil levy. So you will see that the anticipated collection under the 4.8 mil levy for 2012, and these are budget estimates put together by the Office of Budget and Management, is $140 million. That declines to $131 million in 2013. Again, estimates, and that is based on OBM's best calculation. And I will say that historically, OBM, and appropriately so, has been very conservative in its projections. I think we've always been able to essentially take them to the bank, if you will, to make sure that we could rely on them very completely to apprise to comprise the picture that we're facing. But we do see a significant decrease in the amount of resources that both levies will generate for 2012 and 2013, the subject years of the biennial budget. And we have, as we have crafted and made the recommendation to the county executive, who then included those recommendations in the budget to you, try to account for the fact that we will in fact generate less levy resources. That has led the administration to make a choice for the 2012-2013 budget, and that is to use a portion of the public assistance funds. And the distinction between the levy fund, which is the amount of, or the resources that we collect, and we have a balance there above $30 million, and that's we anticipate having that going over the next year or two. The administration has chosen to use a portion of the public assistance funds. Those are the funds that come to us by reimbursement to us from the state for expenses that the state and the federal resources cover for us. And we account for those, or OBM accounts for those essentially repayments or payments to us in a separate funding account from the Health and Human Service levy. And as I think you were briefed in perhaps the first day or two of the county budget hearings, the recommended budget anticipates spending a portion, not all, a portion of the public assistance funds in order to pay for the next couple of years of the county Health and Human Service overall budget. That was a intentional decision. We are able to use the public assistance funds in general in the same way that we can use Health and Human Service levy funds, at least internally for county purposes. So we do have the opportunity to use those funds. They were funds that we earned or were entitled to receive from the state to repay us for money essentially that we had fronted for the state to provide services. And so we made the choice to use those funds to help us achieve the 2012-2013 Health and Human Services budget. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if that answered fully your question.
Pretty close. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to the director. In terms of the public assistance fund, now you told us that there was the balance of $30 million in the levy account that we're going to be down by about, we're estimating $9 million because of the property valuations. And which you didn't say, although I think we pretty much know, but I want to just make sure everybody does. How much is in the public assistance fund?
I'm gonna need to use one of my lifelines to ask the Office of Budget and Management to help me remember what the total for the public assistance funds are.
Good morning. Matt Rubino, Office of Budget Management. A few points on the questions on the public assistance fund. I think right now our estimate is that the total, we'll just call it cash on hand, in the public assistance funds, it's a combination of individual funding streams or pools of dollars, is about $45 million. Now we're proposing for 2 years, because you're approving a 2-year budget, to utilize approximately $12.5 million in the first 2 years of this proposed budget to offset the need to use levy dollars. Let's make a few clarifications if I could. Number one source of funding in the public assistance funds is federal and state reimbursement dollars, of which we make an objective to spend those. I mean, they're meant to reimburse the county for our expenses and for our maintenance of effort on these human service programs. Second major source to the PA fund are levy dollars. Remember, the levy dollars are the county's local match for health and human services. So throughout the year, and in particular at the end of the year, we make a projection. How much is the local match going to be based on projected expense and revenue we've already received? And we request a transfer of levy dollars to the PA side. The PA side is where the actual operating budgets reside. They're all set up within the PA fund, not the levy fund. So what you have is an accumulation of levy dollars that have not been spent for a combination of reasons. We've had some budget surpluses the past 2 years, in particular this year. We've also received some one-time revenue from the federal government this year, over $11 million. So it seems counterintuitive that we'd have a surplus of one-time dollars from the federal government this year, but we have. So we're obligated to spend the dollars in the PA fund first, especially when you consider the fact that a preponderance of that balance is levy dollars. It just happens to be moved to the PA side to fund things we've already been doing. We're not transferring dollars anywhere. We're not creating new programs necessarily. It's money that's there. It's money to fund things we currently do to fund the county's system of health and human services. So I just want to be clear on that. It's not a transfer, and it's not a use different from what we've always done for our mainline health and human service programs.
Director, could you clarify how much is being used from the public assistance fund? Because I had heard a number of $22 million previously.
Mr. Chairman, that number is correct. I'm only speaking, you're approving a 2-year budget. We're requesting approval in 2012 and 2013. The first 2 years would be, I think, $12.5 million. I believe it's $2.5 in 2012. And then I think 10, a little bit over 10 in 2013. 2014, if you add that in, that's where you get around the 22 million. But again, we're making some assumptions on revenue in 2014, expenditure levels in 2014. So if we look at all 3 years, the first 2 years being the biennial budget we're proposing, and then the 2014, the third year, which is an estimate, not a budget necessarily, budget estimate, that's where we come up with the total $22 million utilization of PA funds. And that would get us down to approximately $20 million in the reserve, which is our threshold, because we do want to set money aside for contingency, in particular for some of the critical areas, such as children and family services and things like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Rubino, because I learned something I didn't know from your answer there. I did not know that some of that money was looking forward to 2014. Somehow I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, in years past, we do a 3-year preparation of where we think we'll be. In previous times, we'd only be adopting 1 year. This year, we're adopting 2. So I just wanted to make the clarification. You're approving the 2-year utilization of PA dollars. There's a third year, it's an estimate. Doesn't mean it'll be approved, doesn't mean we'll do it, but I think just to be clear, the first 2 years are that 12. If we're looking at the 3-year horizon, it's the total, the 22. It could be more, could be less if we stayed on that track and decided to continue using reserve dollars in 2014. But there's some unanswered factors that we're unaware of right now.
Well, thank you for that very important clarification.
Yeah, it is. Other questions?
Thanks, Matt.
Okay. Council President Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Werner, I've heard about this public assistance fund, and I appreciate, I agree with Mr. Brady, I really appreciate the information because it wasn't clear to me. But my question is this: by virtue of what ordinance, state law, agreement is this fund set up, and what are the guidelines? So I see we're dipping into it, but I don't want to come back and someone says, well, the guidelines say you can only use it for ABC. I want to make sure that there are no statutory or regulatory restraints on that fund that tell us how it can be used.
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Council President. If I might assist Mr. Werner with that particular answer. Funds that are deposited and resident in the Public Assistance Fund can only be used for those purposes of the fund. So, for example, they would be available for purposes of the County Department of Job and Family Services. There is a procedure under state law, and it's state law, my understanding is, that governs the fund, though there may be hierarchical federal law. There is a procedure in which funds can be transferred out of the Public Assistance Fund to the Health and Human Services Levy Fund. That requires a very specific set of procedures that involves both the actions at the county level, the state tax commissioner, and obtaining an order from the local court.
Okay, so this is the point I've been raising, this exact point I've been raising. I want an explanation from the law department before I approve any transfer. I'm not opposed to the transfer, but I think that we need a specific statement from the law department making sure that we comply with all state, federal, local regulations before we take any of these monies out, because I don't want to take the money, and it's all for good purpose, but I don't want to transfer that fund and then someone comes up and says that we did it improperly.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
The action that the administration is proposing is not a transfer of funds. The expenditures go against the Public Assistance Fund. So the administration is not proposing to transfer any resources outside of the fund. Any dollar that's spent within the County Department of Job and Family Services is expensed through the Human Services Fund. And so there's really not a transfer evident here.
I'm still confused. You're telling me, go ahead, maybe you can explain.
I think I can help with
Okay,
this.
all right.
What the administration is proposing to do is to spend money within the Public Assistance Fund for human services programs for which that fund is intended. And by spending it there, it would reduce the draw on the regular levy account. And so it's never transferred. They're just going to spend the money there. And the levy fund basically operates by providing subsidies. And to the greater extent that money is available from other sources, then a lower subsidy is required from the levy. And so by spending money within the Public Assistance Fund for programs that fund is intended to be used for, then not as much money will have to be spent from the levy fund itself.
Okay, as long as we are complying with the state and federal guidelines, I just don't want to be taking money out of something that we shouldn't be taking the funds out of. Okay, that's fine.
And Mr. Chairman, to the Council President, we can certainly get you a very complete description of the Public Assistance Fund, and we would be happy to do that. But in response to Mr. Miller's comments, the money is staying within the legally allowed uses from the Public Assistance Fund. The County Department of Job and Family Services organization that Joe mentioned is what the state thinks of the Department of Health of Human Services at the county level. So the state considers us, for the Office of Health and Human Services, and all the subsidiary parts of the department to be the County Department of Job and Family Services, and that's the way the dollars flow down to us to manage it from the federal and state sources.
Now, there is the matter that it does mean that we're going to spend more money on health and human services than then the levies will generate during the same time frame. So for a long-term ongoing basis, we have to be aware of that, but it's not a transfer. Councilman Greenspan.
Thank you. Actually, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This my question may be directed more towards Mr. Rubino than to you. If I could ask him to come up again. No.
Just second ask a question.
I called him
for it.
about this. I'm dovetailing on Councilmember Brady's question because he brings up a good point. I'm confused now because all we've heard, this budget's a 2-year budget. The title on the front page is 2 years. We've heard $22 million for 2 years, dip it into the PA reserve. Now we're hearing it's only $12 million for 2 years and $10 million for 3. What's the answer?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, the narrative in the budget plan is always documented that's for the total 3-year horizon we present. You're approving 2 years, but we're reporting and describing, in a lot of cases, 3-year impacts on some of these items. The PA reserve is one such area. So we have within the 2012 and 2013 proposed budget, the first 2 years of that 3-year horizon that you are required to adopt is $12 million. 2014 is an estimate, all things remaining the same. If we continued with the strategy, we would burn an additional 10 or so million. But again, that depends on factors that govern what happens in 2014. So that is the one clarification. But we do describe that reserve for 3 years, 2012 to 2014, I believe, in the book. But I just wanted to clarify that you're approving the first 2 years of that plan. And one other thing to consider, if you look at Schedule 7, which is the levy utilization report, we go through 2014, and we're showing in 12, 13, and 14 a balanced levy fund because we're offsetting the need to dip into the levy reserve by spending money we already have on the PA side. I know it's complicated, but again, a lot of those dollars are levy dollars. They just happen to be moved over to expend out of those operating budgets. If we were to extend that report to 2015, 2016, 2017, you wouldn't see that break-even point anymore because we started looking at this concept after mid-year review and realized based on what we have in that PA reserve, you have approximately about a 3-year window. If you wanted to use reserve down to that 20 million threshold level, you have about 3 years, which just happens to be the last year of that report. But if we were to go out and do a 10-year forecast, based on the factors we know now, certainly you would see the levy reserve start to erode because we only have about a 3-year window based on these factors that we've presented to you. It buys us some time, and I agree with the chairman, it's not a permanent solution, but we're obligated to spend money we have in the PA fund. It's for things we already do. We're not creating new programs or doing anything outside of the normal realm of health and human services at Cuyahoga County. And we're not transferring the dollars. It's there. It's seeded within the operating budget. So it's actually fairly straightforward when we understand that levy dollars flow over to fund human services. They happen to be in a separate and distinct financial and budgetary structure called public assistance funds.
Thank you. I have a separate question. Tomorrow we're going to meet to go over this
Yes.
replenishment program, so I'd like to keep this
Yes.
in that discussion. In the total budget, 2 years,
Okay.
in 12 and 13, how much are we dipping into reserves in total? Is it just 12 million in total, or are there other reserve funds that we're utilizing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Councilman Greenspan, we do utilize reserve and other funds. Each type of funding source, in a sense, has its own set of rules. I'll give you an example. General fund, we have a financial policy that states on normal occasions, we will budget current expenditures based on anticipated resources for that year. So general fund's pretty cut and dry. We tend not to dip into reserve unless it meets the 3 or 4 policy keys that we have to unlock that reserve, one-time uses, unanticipated expenses, and so on. Take a fund such as the health insurance fund or workers' compensation funds. Those dollars reside in that separate funding structure, but they're meant to be spent. You don't necessarily track an operating deficit or surplus in a fund like that, an agency or trust fund, like you would in a general fund. So we do expend those dollars down, and we expend them, I don't know an exact amount, but let's just say it's 10 or 15 million. But we're supposed to do that. They're used for a specific purpose. We're not meant to build a reserve above a certain point in those funds. Another area where I think we're spending down, and this is somewhat outside the council's purview, is the Board of Developmental Disabilities. They are spending down reserve this year and into next year. They can present that information when I think they have a hearing scheduled They're sitting on a substantial cash balance, and I think they anticipate spending some of those dollars starting next year. They can give you details on that, but there are areas where we are obligated to spend down reserve. The general fund, though, being the most sensitive and the most critical of our pooled resources, we obviously hold on spending down reserve in that particular area for a variety of reasons.
Are we drawing down the general fund reserve at all?
We're showing reserves on balance that would show a draw on that reserve. We're not showing it in the operating expenditure line. We're holding general fund dollars on reserve for stated purposes, which if you look at Schedule 1 or the schedules that follow Schedule 1, we're denoting what those reservations are, and we discussed those, I think, at the first budget hearing.
I know this is off topic.
To Councilman Greenspan on this point, if you would note on the bottom of page 1-21, the narrative says that we're intending to use reserves in the public assistance, self-insurance, and real estate assessment funds. So it names 3 funds.
Yeah, that's another good point, Mr. Chairman and the council member. Real estate assessment, obviously next year is a big year. We have the full reappraisal. So we're spending down resources that have accumulated over the past few years to accomplish that reappraisal. So another example that dollars set up in distinct funding sources at times are meant to be spent down. There's a purpose for that, and those are clearly defined. So I don't necessarily compare every instance of how we fund a program or a project as we do with general fund operations.
Right. Now, Mr. Chair, the reason I ask is I just want to make sure that I understand the other financing uses that's listed on 2-2. I want to understand what comprises that $195 million, because I believe in 2012, because I do believe that part of the levy reserve is in that number, but I also want to understand, because my question is very simple. I just want to know what reserve funds we're using, whether it's applicable or not, or we can or we can't. Just what are we using into our reserves?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, specifically Schedule 2-2, other uses are subsidies from the general fund and levy fund to other programs. Schedule 3 breaks those out, and we went through that a few weeks ago, but Schedule 3 gives you an idea where are we sending either general fund dollars or levy dollars. Of that 195 we have in 2012 proposed, most of that is from the levy fund, and the general fund is subsidizing debt service and economic development bond payments, county airport, county planning commission, and some other areas of programs in the justice area and development. But the bulk of the other uses line is levy dollars that are meant to flow over and fund programs in health and human services. And that's what Schedule 7 then breaks out. Of that 195, the portion of other uses related to levy going to health and human services, Schedule 7 gives you a breakout of how are we utilizing that $130 or $140 million coming out of the levy fund.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Yes, Councilman Brady.
I don't want to belabor this, but I want to be, clear. This public assistance fund is quite substantial. Without taking more than 5 minutes, how do we get to the place where we have this much money in a public assistance fund set aside like this?
Mr. Chairman, really 2 reasons. One of which is more revenue from federal and state reimbursement than anticipated to cover expenses that are actually lower than estimated this year in particular. Now we have fairly sizable budget surplus in some of the large health and human service agencies. But the other piece, again, is important to remember, we're transferring levy dollars to health and human service programs, which again are funded out of these public assistance funds. They're individual pools that make up this greater piece of public assistance funding. We transfer those dollars based on an estimate. We're estimating revenue from other intergovernmental sources or transfer payments will be one amount. And we have expenditures that are anticipated to come in at a certain level, and that's how we decide how much in levy dollars do we want to bring over as our local match over to the PA side or the health and human service side to provide that local match and fully fund those programs. I think what we've seen over the past 2 years, we have a surplus of levy dollars have been brought over. So we've transferred more than enough to cover expenses in those operating budgets. But those dollars are already there. We're not going to move them back to the levy fund. They're there, so it's a first in, first out situation. Let's spend those dollars first. Then we can continue moving dollars over from the levy fund above and beyond what the operating status of that fund can maintain. Because right now we're reflecting a balanced levy fund, meaning the money that's being shipped out over to the Health and Human Service side is exactly equal to the anticipated revenue into the levy fund.
But, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Urbino, this fund at this level did not exist a few years ago.
Mr. Chairman and the council member, it was not as high. We've always carried some reserve.
What about 10 years ago?
10 years ago, I couldn't tell you about 10 years ago. It was probably not this high. Mm-hmm. This is fairly substantial balance, and this is why the discussion started.
And so we are, I'll just say fortunate to be in a position to be able to cover the gap in the loss of funds from the levy. But we're not always, we won't be in this position perhaps in a few years, and so we're going to have to do some we're going to have to be thinking down the road in order to be in a position to be able to adequately deliver services in this county a few years from now?
Mr. Chairman and Councilmember Brady, I would agree with that statement. It's, again, we have a variety of challenges. This is one solution. It's not permanent. It does provide us adequate resources for the next 2 or 3 years, though, to offset what we know is coming down the line, probably a reduction in property tax collection from the levy. And we may have additional challenges when it comes to state or federal funding. We just don't know yet. So it behooves us to take advantage of the resources we have now and to use them appropriately for things we are already doing as part of our mainline provision of health and human services in the county.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Councilman Rogers?
Just one final for Mr. Urbino. So you made mention, and this is just for further clarity, the PA fund is essentially made up of the surplus of levy dollars. And there are additional funds. You made mention of an $11 million one-time fund from the federal government. Are there additional places where money would be deposited into the PA fund?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, no, those are the two main sources. And again, it's the reserve in the PA funds. From a budgetary financial reporting standpoint, we may speak in terms of a fund, but each individual program, Department of Children and Family Services, Senior and Adult, they have their individual operating fund that is a component of the overall, what we would term, public assistance fund.
Okay, thank you very much, Director. That was a wading in the weeds, but I think a very important one. I think it's good that we did that. Director, I have one question, which is that under the prior, just before the end of the prior government, we used some discretionary funds, which is a system that we're no longer using to fund a program called the Metanoia Project, which provided $25,000 to help provide a program to help the homeless during the coldest winter months. And my question is whether funding for the upcoming year for that program is included in the budget, and if not, what we would need to do to get that program included.
Mr. Chairman, the commissioners made the decision in 2010 to provide a $25,000 grant to the Metanoia organization, which I think does house homeless folks, I think, at a church in Tremont to help them get through the winter. When the original proposal came in to the commissioners and they passed it along to us in the Human Services Department, we had discussions within the Human Services Department as well as with Ruth Gillette from the Office of Homeless Services. And the commissioners made the decision based on a recommendation from us to fund it for a single year. And we have had discretionary requests before, and normally what the commissioners would do is ask us to look at those requests to see if they were consistent with the county's policy or direction that we were taking in whatever substantive area the grant request was for. So we did fund it. We were clear in the contract or the grant agreement with Metanoia that it was on a one-time basis. So to answer specifically your question, we did not include it in our contract line. The contract was with the Office of Health and Human Services and came out of our contract line. We do not have an amount of money designated for Metanoia in the 2012 contract line. So we would essentially need an additional appropriation in order to be able to provide support for Metanoia or for any other discretionary use.
Okay. Councilman Trent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate all the hard work that's gone into the two-year budget. However, it sounds as though the harbinger of concern is not necessarily even for the 2-year, because we've been able to find some funds that I think has been alluded to by my colleague, Councilman Brady and Councilman Rogers over here. But my real concern is none of us anticipate this. We're only here for 2 years as far as what our commission and direction is to look out there in the future. The ability to go higher on the Health and Human Service levy probably is minimal in the future. We know that the pressure is going to be out there. What are you doing out there from a budgetary standpoint to find ways in which merger, consolidation, technology, all those things are starting to be built right now in the thinking process in this 2-year budget, so that we can start to implement, because the likelihood of the PA fund assistance going to be there in 2 years from now is going to be slim to none, probably. The federal government is not going to come in with those kind of funds to help bail us out. What do you see as a way in which you can bring your department in line with the cost to drive those costs down?
Mr. Chairman and the Councilman, and I will answer your question. I guess what I would suggest is I don't believe that the use of the PA fund is bailing us out at this point. It is an appropriate use of the PA fund, which is accumulated to this point to help us pay for the provision of services. I don't disagree with your point that we don't know what the future of it will be, so we don't know in 2 years, when you're considering the 2014 and 2015 budget, whether or not the PA fund will be in the same position that it is right now to assist us in providing service. But now to the basic parts of your question, I mean, I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen a enormous disinvestment by the state and federal government in the work that we do locally for human services. And I think despite that time and despite a much smaller workforce, we have continued to provide service to folks, whether it's child welfare, senior services, child support, public assistance, in ways by re-engineering the way that we deliver service. There are certain restrictions on the way that we can do that, because we're a creature for the provision of those services of the federal and state government. And while we have some liberty or some flexibility to change the way we deliver services, it's not entirely within our control. I think that the folks that you'll hear from later today from each of the separate departments of the human services world of the county have thoughts about and have made lots of plans to better and more efficiently provide service. We have, though, challenges at times of getting those new ways of business being approved at the state and federal level. The county executive has been willing, as I know you all have, to take that message where we need regulatory relief to Columbus or Washington, and in fact, the county executive has already started that. So I think we're going to continue to need to look at ways to try to deliver services more effectively and efficiently and more cheaply. And I don't, as I stand here, and you we'll obviously hear from the other directors for the balance of today. Each of them, though, in their own way, is trying to figure out how to live in a less resource-filled world than we were used to in the past. Part of that is technology. I think the county executive has talked to us about his interest in supporting thoughtful changes, and we've worked very closely with Jeff Mowry on that to try to identify ways to use technology in a fashion that will increase our efficiency without increasing our need for staff. But again, part of the issues that we need help on in order to grapple with that is assistance at the state and federal level, because there are some things we just can't do on our own. I think we may be getting close, even with the resourcefulness of all of our directors and leadership staff, we may be getting close to doing as much as we can with the existing status quo and flexibility that we do have from the state and the Fed. So I think as 2012 unfolds, you will see from us more proposals on ways that you can assist us in taking the message, primarily at first to Columbus, to get us the kind of relief that will allow us to live in a shrinking resource world over the long term. But I will say, I mean, I'm proud of the fact that over the last 4 or 5 years, as we've endured pretty significant budget cuts as well as significant, and it isn't borne out by the discussion that we're having today, although you'll hear about it from the other staff who will be up here. I mean, we have seen departments that have shrunk considerably from their size back in the 2007, 2008 level. And I think we've still been able to provide a level of service that we are proud of, but it gets increasingly hard. And we have to look to new models like technological fixes, I think, to continue to become more efficient as we go along. But you stated very well the challenge that we have. I think the fact that we've been able to continue to provide service effectively over the last couple of years makes me confident that we're going to be able to continue to do that, but it's going to be a challenge.
And, Mr. Chairman, to follow up on, are those tools that you need built into this 2-year budget so that we will have the training, the implementation, the software, all those things needed to help operate under that leaner vision that you're talking about?
Mr.
Or is
Chairman,
that something that's going to be asked in a future budget? That the time to do it is now, to make sure that we take advantage of that right now.
Mr. Chairman and Councilman Tron, I would say that a portion of what you're asking for is contained in the recommended budget. We are continuing to have discussions with Mr. Mowry, and some of the resources that we need for portions of the technological fixes for us may well come through his budget as opposed to the Human Services budget. It would ultimately be paid for by Human Service dollars if it ends up benefiting us. But I do think the bulk of the efficiency approach that we want to use is contained in the recommended budget.
I'm sorry, I need to then follow up by basing your comment that if Mr. Mowry's budget is going to suggest that ways to improve in your area is going to involve technology expenditures, then those funds are going to further to be hitting your budget as it goes forward. Is that not correct?
Mr. Chairman, the Councilman, that's true, but without knowing yet exactly what the prescription is or what we need in terms of hardware or software or other kinds of fixes, it wouldn't have been responsible from my perspective to include that in the budget now, because we don't know what the price tag for that is. I do know that we would be required, if we are able to work, and I think we will effectively with Mr. Mowry and his organization, we will find the resources and come back to you and talk to you about them before, obviously, we implement them.
So that'll put further pressure on what we just
It would put further short-term pressure on us, but if it fixes a longer-term way of delivering services effectively, I think it'd be a valuable investment.
I agree.
Yes, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, to members of the committee, Mr. Schron, most of the human service agencies use state-regulated and state-operated systems. So there are, in fact, as Mr. Werner had identified, some things that we can do on a local basis with respect to technology. Where we really expect and see the potential for more broad-scale changes are not local expenses, but state-level expenses. As one such example, under the Affordable Care Act, the state has the option of replacing its 1980 COBOL-based eligibility system with a more modern system and getting 80% federal reimbursement. While that particular decision has not been made yet, that is one example of an automated investment outside of the county budget that could provide some significant assistance to a number of our staff. So there are other opportunities, I'm trying to say, that are outside of your budget.
Do we know the status of that, and is there anything we can do as a council or as the county executive to help facilitate that taking place?
To the councilman through the chair, it is my understanding that the current state administration has made a tentative decision to go forward with that, with the final decision expected from the governor's office on or about the end of the year.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next on our agenda is our new Director of Children and Family Services, Patricia Rideout, to discuss Children and Family Services and the Tapestry System of Care. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by refreshing your memories about who we are and what we do at the Division of Children and Family Services. I'm looking at slide 2, which represents our agency's mission, which is to assure that children at risk of abuse and neglect are protected and nurtured within a family and with the support of the community. Also listed here are what we consider to be the 4 imperatives of the work that we do. First, that children who can't be protected within their own home must be removed and placed. Secondly, that we must reduce the number of children who come into custody unnecessarily. So we've got to make very good judgments. Thirdly, that children must be placed in the most family-like setting which can meet their needs. And last, that all children must have a time-limited permanency plan and that we must execute those well. So the kinds of things we do to accomplish that mission and those imperatives are the following on slide 3. First, we operate a 24-hour hotline, which receives all referrals from the public alleging abuse and neglect. And in calendar year 2010, that amounted to close to 39,000 calls. Secondly, we then investigate the allegations of abuse and neglect, which are screened in, and that number is approximately 14,000 plus, again, last year. After investigating those allegations, we make a decision about whether that family requires ongoing services. And on any given day last year, we were providing such services to over 6,500 kids. The services are, in part, helping families with their kids at home, and that's really the majority of the cases. And then a smaller percentage, a quarter to perhaps 30%, whose children are placed out of home, and which we are managing those cases on an ongoing basis. The next range of things that we do is around adoption, post-adoption, and other permanency. We must make sure that the kids and families we work with end up in a place where children are with a permanent family situation. We currently have about 600 kids waiting, in fact, for a permanent family. I would also mention that many of the children that we take into care are placed with relatives long-term if they are not reunified with their family or adopted. The final service area that I want to mention that we do is to provide independent living services for our older youth who sadly may not go back home to their families or find another permanent family. And so far this year, we've had approximately 16 young people a month who age out of our system, sadly, without that kind of permanent setting. And so we need to make sure that they have independent living skills that will allow them to navigate the world. On a more positive note, I'll tell you that about 60 of those young people did graduate from high school this year. On to our funding sources. In 2012 and 13, our total funding is anticipated at $147 million plus. And as we've been discussing already this morning, a great deal of that comes from the federal government and state government, $66 million plus. I would note that about $40 million of that amount comes to us as federal 4E reimbursement through the state for the costs of placement of children. And we are currently operating at about an 86% penetration rate at collecting those funds. The balance of our funding is the HHS levy funding, which we've been discussing, about 55% of our budget, 80 million plus. The next slide provides a comparison of this year's budget looking forward to the next 2 years, and as you can see, things are pretty flat. Next, on slide 6, is a summary of our expenses for 2012, which we estimate to be $147 million. The largest category is services for our clients, and then, of course, salary and benefits, our personnel figures, followed by contracts, and the remainder controlled other operating commodities and capital. The next slide is a visual picture of our client services expenditures, which amount to almost $72 million. The largest amount here is purchased care for those kids we talked about who need to be placed in out-of-home care. The next largest category, that's $51.7 million. The next largest at $9 million is adoption services. And following, you can see we have other client services, including Tapestry, System of Care, wraparound services, costs associated with children placed in our own agency, county foster homes, as opposed to those purchased privately. Contracts which support our children and families, as well as emergency assistance funds, educational expenses for some of our older youth, and kinship permanency incentives. The next slide is a breakdown of those contract expenditures that we experience. The largest portion of these contracts is for our neighborhood services. We do contract with a wide range of neighborhood collaboratives to serve families close to their own homes. We then have other expenditures for legal services for the county prosecutors who represent us in our litigation. Also for the buildings, our leases and rentals, as well as administrative support consultants, and the rest are county shared services, technological support and maintenance, and parking. Last, just a quick review of what we're all about here. I wanted to mention, and this is on slide 9, some of the changes in our service environment and our business practices which may affect our budget. As council is perhaps aware, we have been reviewing our board and care contracts, those contracts for the placement of children with private providers. And we've been asked to focus on more performance-based, more outcome-focused contracts in the future. So we'll be working very hard on that, and that may in fact change the landscape for our contracting in the future. We are also working to integrate the Tapestry System of Care initiative, which prior to this year was a separate program, and we have absorbed it into the Division of Children and Family Services. We hope to see some benefits in reduced overhead and improved service delivery by having that really valuable program within the Division of Children and Family Services. We will be doing some strategic planning. The division has not been able to do much of that in the last couple of years, and so we're going to return to that and attempt to really take a hard look at priorities and how we can deliver our services better, more efficiently, and with better outcomes for our families. Differential response is the name of a new statewide initiative that will come to Cuyahoga County next year. I believe statewide we will all need to be doing differential response by 2013. And this is an alternative approach to investigation for lower risk cases. So when a call comes into our hotline, and it appears to be of a lower risk concern, after some initial screening, the case would be redirected into a little less adversarial approach to determining what's happening with that family. The state has been piloting this for a number of years with some really good outcomes in terms of child safety and resolution of issues short of a full-blown investigation. So we will be adopting this practice, and it may have some impact on our landscape of service. Technological improvement is something also on our horizon. A couple of examples that we think may make a difference for us are The state, through its newish SACWIS system, has a management reporting system called ROM. I believe that stands for Results-Oriented Management. We are hoping that in time these reports will be very valuable to us as a better technology for measuring and managing our work. And secondly, and I think Rick referenced this, we've been working with Jeff Mowry on a plan to put personal computer tablet type devices in the hands of our investigative staff so that they in fact can be more efficient, because they do spend a great deal of time in the field investigating, going to court. There's a lot of downtime, and we'd like to have them be able to use that time in order to efficiently manage their cases. We believe this technology is a way that they might be able to do that. We're working on adjusting to the many changes in procurement methodology. Not always easy. Our work at the Division of Children and Family Services is often unpredictable, and there's a lot of emergency to what we do. And obviously, good procurement depends on planning and being ready. So we're working on that. Another issue we'll be dealing with is the reaccreditation of our agency, which comes up in 2012. We are accredited through the COA, Council on Accreditation, through the Child Welfare League of America. We'll be working on that. And last, I would just note that happily, the AFSCME contract has been ratified, and that is certainly a change in our service environment to have that settled and ready to move forward with our bargaining unit staff as the year starts. That's the conclusion of my planned presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Director, I'd like to thank you for a comprehensive and yet concise presentation. That was well done. Questions by my colleagues? Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Ryan. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I'm sure that the budget that's been presented for the department is adequate, or it would not be presented. But I know that this department does some of the most challenging, difficult work that the county has the responsibility for. And I wanted to ask you a kind of a difficult question for me to ask you, but I have to be able to understand this as thoroughly as possible to make the best judgment I can. Are there areas where you are stretched under the current budget? And if there are, where are they?
We do have really difficult work, and the unpredictability of it is part of the difficulty. But I do believe that we will be able to work within the budget we have in the coming year. We're trying to be very planful and bring to bear as many improved practices as we can possibly bring to bear. I think we'll be able to work within the budget.
If you could identify one area where you are most pressed and most stretched, where would it be?
Well, I think it's an area that involves our ability to work to get kids back home quicker when they come into our care. It's very complicated because there's not a simple answer to that question. All of our practices contribute to how well we do at reunifying families in a reasonable amount of time. So I think that the things that we're bringing to bear on that challenge, which of course has budgetary implications, the longer kids stay in care, the more expensive it is and the harder it is on them and their families to come back together. But I think that is probably uppermost in my mind, is getting better at the practice of strengthening families so that we can get their kids back with them.
Well, thank you for that. Is this something that some additional funding would help you be able to accomplish?
I am really prepared to work with what I've got.
We know you are prepared to work with what you've got. The question is, would some additional funding help you accomplish your goal?
I think additional funding is always something that a manager appreciates.
Okay, well, I'm going to consider additional funding since you appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Conwell?
To the chair, to the director. On page 3-9, there's a key performance measures chart. Could you explain the 470 estimate for the 2011? It's number 1. It says reduce the children placed outside the county. In your 2011, it said 270, but then when you went up to the estimate, it was 470. I'm not quite getting those
thank you.
numbers. And then the target was 452, so I was kind of stumped on that.
Yep. Councilwoman, there's a typo in this chart. The 2011 number of 270 should have been corrected. The actual number of children placed outside the county in December of 2010 was actually 455, not 270. And so the 2011 estimate and the target for 12 and 13 make a bit more sense, I think, in light of that.
Thank you. Follow-up question. When you transfer the Tapestry administration staff and case management and all those services, that will cost 6.9. That's the approved request, the 6.9 mil. How much savings was had in this reorganization? Do you know?
I don't know that, but I want to make sure that I understand your question. That's not new money. It was simply shifted from one
to
budget
the
into
other.
another. We just absorbed that with the program.
Okay. And then page, through the chair to the director, on the 3-10, the funding sources, you have two miscellaneous funding sources, and I just wanted to know, generally, where do those miscellaneous funds come from?
I need to call on a lifeline for that one. Audrey, can you help? Audrey Beasley.
Hi, Council. Most of our miscellaneous come from collections from, for instance, if we have some miscellaneous collections from people that have sent over some type of donation, things like that, which are minor, as well as miscellaneous comes from other collections from child support, those type of things that we would get. I don't have my specific list, but we call it miscellaneous because it's not really tied to a federal or any type of state funding. So it comes, and it's not general fund subsidy. So it's really just from private people providing some type of refund that they may give us from things that have been overpaid sometimes.
Does this occur all the time?
No, and that's why the percentage is very small when you're looking at in relations to the revenue that offsets our expenditures is very small, and it's really not predictable, and that's why it changes from year to year.
Where does those funds go into we talked about so many funds today. Does that go into your Health and Human Service Fund?
It would be part of our, well, no, it's not coming from the Health and Human Services
Right.
Fund. It's really a miscellaneous. It just goes to offset our costs. For instance, if our cost is 147, we offset it with the federal state funding. We offset it with the subsidy, which is the general levy funds, and then we have the miscellaneous that just offsets that as well.
I guess I just want to know, where does it go? So if I give you $100,000 and it's for miscellaneous fund, where does that $100,000 sit?
It sits in, if it's under our children's services, it would sit in our children's services fund. If it's coming through the public assistance, it would sit as part of the public assistance total dollars for offsetting the Children and Family Services budget.
So depending what I want it for, what I'm donating it for, it would sit in a certain kind of fund.
Right, so you see our funding sources, you see we have two funds. We have the Children's Services, which is the 24A301, that's our public assistance fund. And the bottom, the 28A303, that's our Children's Services Fund. So you see we have two categories. We have miscellaneous up in that fund as well as down in the children's
And
services.
which one is the public assistance fund?
The public assistance is
Is
the
the bottom one?
248301, yes. And that means that whatever miscellaneous income that we're showing here is offsetting our administrative services or expenditures. And if it's down in the children's services fund, those miscellaneous incomes are offsetting whatever expenditures for our client services. Anything that we pay for children and families. And that's the distinction between our two funds.
Further questions?
More, any more? Please proceed.
Through the chair to the director, currently, how many cases are currently given to each social worker?
Our current caseload averages at intake, which are the investigative staff who have up to 30 days to complete their investigation, they are receiving, I believe it's about 10.7 new cases per month. It's been on an average fairly steady for a while, a year or two. They carry more cases than that because they're not always able to conclude the investigation within 30 days, but we're working very hard, in fact, to shrink the number of cases that need to be kept open longer than 30. The ongoing workers who receive cases after the investigation, when it's determined that they need to be maintained for continuing help, approximately 15 point something cases, that's families, and families, of course, have several children sometimes. That's what we're running as an average for those workers right now.
So about an average of 15?
15 to 16, yes.
And director, in your, through the chair to the director, in your professional opinion of caseload ratio, what would you say would be the ideal caseload to a social worker?
It's a really tough question. Requires good time study. And in fact, our statewide Public Children's Services Organization has an RFP out right now to do a time study, because the last one they did 10 years or more ago, so much has changed in terms of what we ask of workers to do regulation-wise. And then, of course, in our county, we've had to do with less, and our staff has shrunk quite a bit. So there's another question about workload changes as certain support staff have been lost, et cetera. So I can't give you a firm number. I think that 15 and 10 are high.
No, remember here, Councilman Brady's wish list now. We want to know, in your professional opinion, how many do you think, if there's additional funding or something like that, that now is the time to say, how many do you feel, in your professional opinion, caseload should go to a social worker? I've been a social worker, so I kind of know.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to see those drop by a couple cases per worker. I think there's a lot of ways to make that happen. A lot of it is about how we do our work, doing it in smarter ways, and those are the things that I'm particularly focused on even this early. We've been working very hard on how the work is done. Certainly lower caseloads make for better work and better practice, and I think better outcomes, so that's our focus.
Okay.
You can come back to me, but it's still on this point, so I just want to make sure. Okay, Director, there are an additional, and I hate to stay on this point, but I know time and stress and all that weighs on how the kids are affected, as well as how the staff, I see there's some talk about sick time and all that plays a part on how they're overwhelmed. I believe the budget said that you wanted to hire 18 new hires. There's a possible 18 new hires. So if you were able to get those additional 18 new hires of social workers, that would in fact play heavily on reducing that caseload size, wasn't it?
The positions that we are seeking through decision items are spread across a number of areas.
Okay, so it's not all social workers?
Not entirely.
Okay. I thought I read somewhere it was focused on social workers.
Oh, there's certainly, the bulk are in that area, and they potentially could affect work, caseload, but most importantly, workload.
But, so even if we said half of that, nine of those would be new social workers that would greatly reduce the caseload sizes that they would have.
It's a matter of math, so greatly, I don't know, but yeah, sure. More workers would reduce caseload size.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Director, and I know this might be a lifeline question, but in your presentation, you said something very quickly about recouping 86% of the available federal or state reimbursements, and I was kind of surprised why that number isn't something like 97% or 98%. And can you put a little more color on what exactly this percentage refers to and why that number is 86% rather than in the upper 90s?
Sure. I'll start it out, and then I will surely use a lifeline. That number refers to the federal 4E reimbursement, which child welfare systems receive to recoup costs of out-of-home care for kids. It's quite a complex calculation that leads to the ability to recoup those funds. We do have a staff who does that work. We also do that work, by the way, for juvenile courts kids in placement who are eligible for this money as well. In terms of the 86, I can tell you that that's pretty good, having worked in many places. It's very difficult for reasons which my lifeline people could do better than I could at explaining to you, to get up to 98, 99%. And so maybe at this point I'd ask, I think Joe could probably do this better than I.
Mr. Gauntner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My understanding, the number that you referenced was not a percentage of federal reimbursement, but it was what Ms. Rideout referenced as the penetration rate, which I understand that to mean of the children served by the department, 86% of them have been found eligible under the federal 4E program. Some of the barriers to that number being higher are as follows. The first of which is that the income eligibility threshold for that number was the equivalent of the cash assistance aid to dependent families financial standard from 1996. So it's not even the current poverty threshold, it's well below the current poverty threshold. Additionally, other barriers are the system that the state of Ohio brought up for the child welfare system called SACWIS does not provide an ease of editing. And just one example. If an application is taken on a child and a social security number has to be entered into the SACWIS system, if that number is in error, previously county staff could just go in and make that edit themselves. Now that particular edit needs to be sent to somebody in Columbus where I'm told, though I don't have immediate firsthand knowledge, it sits in a stack of other edits that centralized staff in the state make. Also, there is an additional requirement, I believe, with respect to the claiming of 4E funds, wherein either this year or the end of last year, the department also needs to enter not just the eligibility information and not just information about monthly billings, but I believe also data on family visits, if I'm correct about that. So whether it be, the state or the federal rules have made the process a little more complex. The system is less user-friendly than it used to be. The financial threshold against which the cases go is well below the poverty standard, so we can have individuals, who are very low income who don't meet that financial test. My understanding, while I do not have the range of experience of Ms. Rideout, but my understanding in talking to other communities is that the 86% rate of eligibility determination is actually quite excellent comparatively.
Yes.
Okay, 86 is looking better. Other questions by my colleagues? Councilman Strawn, then Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the detail work and how well it was laid out. Just a question in regards to actual expenditures of the 147 million that really gets to the person in need in this particular case. By the time you take out purchased care contract, which of the 71 million point nine, the majority of that is purchase contract, which I assume has administrative care contracts, administrative burdens from whatever you're purchasing that, and so that comes off the top before to operate that. Then you come over to our 11.3 million with prosecutor, building, administrative, county shared services, tech support, parking. Of the 147 million, if you had to give us your best estimate as the percentage that actually gets to the person in need, how would that 147 million be out there as far as a percentage by the time you take off all those other costs carry? And I realize they have to be done. I don't doubt that the purchase care has an administrative cost that they put on the top of their contract, and some are high, some are low. I assume that they're all over the range, as we always see through people of that kind of area as far as what their administrative costs are. Do you have in your mind what that $147 million is divided up as far as really getting to the person in need?
Well, I think the best place to see the answer to that question, Councilman, is to zero in on the client services expenditures, which are 72 million, and that's the pie chart on slide 7. And for example, within client services, those are really all expenses that go directly to kids and families. So within that area, while yes, there is purchased foster care for kids, there are also things like supportive services for helping parents learn how to parent better. There are services for parents who are having trouble getting along with their teenagers. We have folks who go into the home and do that work directly with them. We have people who go into foster families and work directly with them to make sure that we don't have disruptions because of problems they're having getting along with their kids or other stresses. We have a lot of emergency assistance. We buy cribs, we buy food, bus tickets, pay people's rent, ambulances, those sorts of things. And then through the Tapestry System of Care program that's new within our department, that project provides an awful lot of very hands-on help to families through managing services to them, providing what we call wraparound services to meet very unique needs of families with a big range of service capacity to be able to tailor things to unique needs. So I think that's the part of our budget that I look to when I think about your question and what's actually reaching individual families. And again, I would remind you that the great majority of families we serve, we don't have their kids in care. We're out there dealing with them while they're trying to raise their kids at home and strengthen their families so that they can do that safely.
For clarity to the chair, it was my appreciation of this chart that represent what you just described is about 25% of this chart, where 75% is a purchased service that has administrative costs from wherever we're buying that service from. And does that represent, just like we know that there are some charities that you donate $1 and 90% of that goes to the valid charity, and others 15% goes to the valid charity. Of the bulk of where we spend the money on this chart, 75%, do we have an accounting as to what is the norm of getting to the child versus the norming of the administrative costs? My colleague, Councilman Conwell, was alluding to the cost when we send a student or child out of the state, and I assume that those have to have fairly high administrative costs, what is that dollar amount that actually gets to our needy person? Not the 25% you just described is very well described on this pie chart. It's the other 75%. The bulk of our monies are going into purchase contracts.
I would like to get back to you with that number. We do
Take
know,
a lifeline and just get, yeah.
don't have it right here, but certainly
to
can
me,
get it.
that is where, if you're targeting where can we save money, how can we be more effective, where can we negotiate? One of the things we talked about last year was looking at the possibility of 2-year contracts with our service provider in this very area. What we got was a 9-month contract. What we then got was a 3-month contract. And now we're looking at another 1-year contract. And I only suggest that as a business person, the longer the contracts, the more effective you can negotiate on both sides, service provider and we as the beneficiaries in that. And if we're talking about redoing our thinking process, the tool that our budget director provided was a 2-year budget. Why aren't we looking at that right now in this particular bulk of where we're spending our money? And I just come back and ask that question.
Director, could you try to do an analysis to get us an estimate on what that percentage of direct service to administration is, and get a report back to Trevor McAleer, our budget person, so it can be distributed to all council. It's a very important oversight kind of question, but I also recognize that it's not the kind of thing that you would necessarily have immediately available without doing a little study.
Thank you.
And that wasn't necessary to put you on the spot. It was more for the good of the whole. Thank you.
Councilman. Sure.
Okay. Anything else?
Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Jones and Councilman Germana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Rideout, your projected budget has a $2.8 million surplus for this year. Where does that money physically sit? If that were to remain by the end of this year, where does it sit physically? What account?
May I ask for a little help on that? David.
Good morning. I'm David Dombrowski with the Department of Children and Family Services. I think the $2.8 million surplus is largely in salaries, and ultimately at the end of the year, that'll go back into the free balance.
Goes back where?
To the free balance of the budget. So we will give that money back to OBM, and then OBM does with it what they will.
Is that where the public assistance fund comes in?
Matt would have to help me on that question as to where those dollars were actually replaced by OBM, but from the department to the county, it goes back to OBM from us.
Matt Rubino, Office of Budget Management, OBM. The dollars remain in the fund balance, so the PA fund is the short answer. Remember, each agency operating budget has its own distinct funding source, so the dollars aren't spent, they remain in the fund balance.
Are they still earmarked to go back to the department, or they from the PA fund they could be used?
No, Mr. Chairman, the council member, no, they reside in the distinct funding source for each individual operating budget. So if it was DCFS in this case, those dollars remain in the reserve of the fund that actually provides the funding sources for operations for DCFS. So each year you're appropriating resources out of that funding source, whether it's in reserve or whether it's current revenue coming in from federal state transfer payments or levy funds.
So is it fair to say that PA fund dollars are all earmarked or reserved for some department?
Mr. Chairman, to the council member, that'd be an accurate statement. That's why we have distinct pools of funding within that greater public assistance fund or health and human services funding source. Each operating budget, or we'll call them departmental or agency budgets, is funded out of their own distinct funding source. We're not moving dollars back and forth in most cases. There's almost a one-for-one relationship with the operating budget, which we're reviewing. We'll be appropriating resources. We appropriate those resources out of the individual or distinct fund, or we call them sub-funds here because we have such an expansive budget, distinct sub-fund. when you approve the budget. So we're giving approval to expend those resources for these programs.
Well, a PA fund actually has dollars that have been matched from the levy fund, dollars that have come back from a surplus. Is that fair to say?
Now, Mr. Chairman and the council member, yes. Whatever is not spent, if we have a budget surplus projected for Department of Children and Family Services, for example, we'd appropriated a certain level. Let's say it's 140 million. They only spend 130 million. There's $10 million that we're not going to expend. The funding is still there, or would have been provided for, so it remains in reserve until it's appropriated again as part of the ongoing, in this case, biennial budget process.
PA fund captured in our budget?
In multiple places, Councilman Jones. Number one, if you look on the all fund summary, which is in the schedule section, I believe it's Schedule 4, that's the entire county rolled up, and the PA fund revenue and expenditures are part of that summary, so that's the high level. Also within each departmental write-up or section within this document, that revenue chart that we provide for each department is showing you, in essence, what are the resources coming in to that fund or funds. In the case of DCFS, they have two distinct funding sources. They have their public assistance fund, and they also have board and care fund. So they have two distinct pools of resources, if you will, to provide funding for their operation. Some of the other human service agencies, such as Department of Senior and Adult Services, they have one distinct funding source. They have one piece of that overall public assistance fund. But again, it's a one-to-one relationship. We appropriate dollars for operations. It may be multiple budgets, but again, we're appropriating resources out of their funding source.
When a department has a surplus, do most departments spend the bulk of the money? Is this 2.8 a typical surplus? Or, I imagine no one spends to the exact penny. Would you describe this as having spent the bulk of it, and are most departments spending the majority of their funds?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, what we'd like to do because the budget is a plan, what we like to do is be able to plan anticipated expenditures to be mostly in line with the current revenue that comes in. We don't want a very large variance either way. Obviously, if you're to the good, that can be positive, but again, it's also an indication that either there was something unanticipated that occurred. We either had less employees, spent less dollars for contracted services, or we had unanticipated revenue that may be driving either an operating surplus. In the case of a budget, the expenses are less than we anticipated, or we may be spending less than the actual funding or revenue coming into the fund. So there's two ways to look at that. But ideally, when we're looking at budget variance, how do we compare against the plan that we set up at the beginning of this year? We like to be right around where we plan. I mean, that's the idea. I think if you're a little bit to the good, that's great. In this case where we have a sizable surplus, it's not a bad thing per se, but again, we need to identify, okay, what happened this year that makes it distinct from the previous year going into 2012? Because the idea is we're going to provide the best type of financial and budget planning that corresponds directly with programs in operating budgets, because those drive the budget. It's not the other way around. What the county does, what the county chooses to make a priority, drive where the dollars are allocated. That's a key thing. So when we develop this plan, in this case, we're doing a 2-year plan. We want to be as close and accurate as possible to provide the policymakers and the administrative staff a good plan to work off of and continue making decisions and deciding how we allocating resources, how well are we doing at using the resources that have been given to us through the budget process. So that's my long-winded answer to your question. But
okay. If you go back 1 year, say 2010, and I don't remember if there was a surplus or not in this department, but assuming there was, where would that be reflected? Would it show up in their next year budget, or would it not show up?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, no. And we'll go back to 2010. I believe Children and Family Services did have a departmental budget surplus. Can't remember the amount, but I'm almost positive they did. If you wanted to see the status of what their budget surplus was, we have prior year reports online that you can review those to see what have the patterns been. But each budget cycle, we start anew. We look at, okay, what was the experience from the current year, which we're using somewhat as a basis for the 2012-2013 budget, and where are the areas that we could either reduce or increase how we're allocating their budget across line items. So we use that as a learning experience. Again, if they spent less of revenue that's already there, that's money sitting in their fund balance. But how we decide to appropriate those resources is dependent wholly on this process, the budget development process.
So those earmarked dollars from 2010, could and they're not reflected in this budget, could they at some point go back and request those earmarked dollars in the PA fund?
Mr. Chairman and the council member, no, we would treat each budget development cycle as separate and distinct. Just consider it a plan. If they spent less than the original plan, doesn't mean we necessarily go back and appropriate unspent dollars from the prior year. We look at what are the objectives of an agency from year to year, what are the anticipated levels of revenue coming in. In this case, we know we have a lot of state and federal sources, we have local sources. How can they best use those on what they normally do? What are the key things that they have to do? And that's how we set that plan, the budget. We don't necessarily look back at money unspent and say, well, we need to credit that agency for unspent dollars. We look at how well have they used the resources to meet their objectives, their priorities. And again, the budget follows suit. The budget is an overlay, a necessary overlay of how we're going to allocate resources to do these things from year to year.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman, you brought up an important area of inquiry, and one thing that we're going to be looking at going forward when we get the information sometime in the first quarter next year is the 2011 actual. And I have hopes that it's going to look a little bit better than what we currently have. And if that's the case, it would both mean that we have a little bit more resources to work with, and also that we did better in terms of revenue versus expenditure. But we're gonna look and see if that's the case. But if we in fact have a surplus, well, then that just provides a little extra money into the general pool that we can then decide through this process we're going through now as to how to allocate it for the services that are needed going forward. I would like to welcome Councilwoman Simon to the committee, and the next questioner is Councilman Germana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is going back to Councilman Schron's point. I had the same thought. But since he is asking, or the chairman's asking you to get the statistic, just in light of the 86%, I had the same thought as the chairman about 86%. So if it's not too much trouble, I think it's important if we could get the statistics from comparable Toledo, Franklin County, Hamilton, just to see if their administrative cost is, if we're doing better or worse than the other urban counties.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
Otherwise, if we just got the one statistic, that still wouldn't tell us as far as best practices.
No, we will look into that for you as well. This is, I should say, this is all part of the conversation that we're having, which I referenced about looking specifically at our board and care contracts in the year ahead. You referenced the shorter period of time we contracted with them. During that period of time, we are tasked with doing an analysis and, coming back with a report. So certainly the things you're asking are part of what we're working on, and we'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Councilman Rogers? Okay. Mr. Gauntner?
Excuse me. I just wanted to make a brief comment on the nature of what might be referred to as an administrative expense. And I think that's going to vary widely around the state, and I'm sure Ms. Rideout will do her best to sort it out. Is, for example, a prosecutor who appears in court to advocate for a child who's been abused, is that an administrative expense? Is a caseworker, who's doing eligibility, is that an administrative expense? One of the areas in which there is some data that I think will allow Ms. Rydell to respond in part, when the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services reviews rates for the different residential providers, they do break down their approved rates into a service component and to an administrative component. So that is perhaps one of the clean sets of data. But I think as this question, goes around the state, there will be different interpretations as to what is service to the individual and what is, an administrative expense.
To the chair, that was exactly my point, is the administrative services for the outside service providers is a clean number that we should be able to identify how we're spending our taxpayers' dollars for services versus administration within those third party. And that represents 75% of that pie chart.
Councilman Rogers.
Yeah, Mr. Gautner spoke to what I was going to mention, but I want to further illustrate the point. I'm just wondering, you've divided this chart up into, $72 million for client services, but I would imagine that in the salary number of the 38 million, that, for example, you mentioned for students that are youngsters that are aging out of the foster care system and your independent living services program, I would imagine that an individual is working with that child on those, skills that they need. So, that's shown in our salary side, but it's actually a direct service to an individual child being provided by an individual. So it gets messy. It's a lot clearer if you're looking at the administrative costs for our contracted services, but if you actually add in the people that on the salary side that are working directly with families, it's actually your client services pie piece gets a lot larger, I would imagine.
I think that's absolutely true, and I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but the percentage of our staff who, in fact, are providing direct services to families, I know that we have how many hundreds of just frontline workers? Over 500 just in that category out of our just over 800. So to your point, yes,
Right.
All of those staff, in fact, there are administrative costs associated with them. Those are our employees, are having direct contact on an everyday basis with.
Councilwoman Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, to the Director.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. Good morning. Just a question, if you know, with regard to the prosecutor contracts to provide legal services to the department, do you know if those are annual contracts or what the nature of the terms are in terms of time? And if not, you can get back to me.
But if somebody knows quickly. Sorry? Thank you. Annual, 12 months.
And is there an idea when the current contract expires? Mr. Chair?
Calendar
years?
year.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilman Greenspan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of to the general point on the administrative costs on the contract services, the clerk pointed out that in, for example, the Berea Children's Home contract, there is a stipulation where they are to report back to us the administrative cost allocation. So those numbers should not be difficult to obtain. It's just a matter of being able to get that. And I think we talked at some point about trying to set, or if there was a set standard of a percentage of administrative cost of services, but I don't recall that went anywhere. But as far as us being able to determine what those numbers are, contract stipulate it's to be provided by at least that one is provided by the provider. I would imagine that standard language for most contracts.
I believe they submit those to the state as a condition of.
And they are provided for the board of care contracts, a breakdown of administrative costs and maintenance.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Ms. Cottonwell.
Just had, the chair to the director, I had one final question, and it's regarding tapestry system of care.
Okay.
On the page 3-17, from the projected 2011 budget, there was actually an increase of $493,000. So could you tell me what that is for? Because on page, and I might be confusing the two, page 3-18, it actually went down. There was a savings of the FTEs. It was about 540,000. So I don't know how on one side you're going, actually there's an increase, but it says in the staffing levels, it actually went down. The money went, there was a savings. So I might be confusing something.
Very new program to me. If it's all right with Councilwoman, may I call on Karen Storman? Our Tapestry System of Care leader.
Members of council, you were referring to page 3-17.
Yeah, could you state your name for all of us?
Thank you. Karen Storman, Tapestry System of Care within the Division of Children and Family Services. And I'm sorry, just
in the 2011 projected budget, it's actually, when it goes up to the 2012, there's actually an additional increase of 493,000. But then on the following page, your staffing levels kind of state that you had a decrease in funding. So I might be mixing some fundings or something. Just want some explanation on that.
And I'm not seeing the increase. I'm sorry.
For your 2011, all funds.
Yes.
2011 projected was 6.5.
Yes.
Then your 2012 base budget was 6.9. So that's roughly about 493,000.
And I believe in the 2012 estimate on the 3-18, they're showing some miscellaneous revenue that I don't believe it accounts for the total, but I believe that may be where it is. We have some interagency agreements with the county partners, both with our Family and Children First and our juvenile court, that is potentially showing the increase. The decrease as far as staff reductions. I have to revisit these figures to really get an accurate response.
Okay, so what you're saying is that for the additional increase at the top, it was due to interagency agreements, but it has nothing to do with the staffing level.
No, and I believe the explanation underneath the chart on page 18 indicates that revenue reimbursements from those two sources, and I would have to look at how the staff reduction was taken into account, because I'm not quick on the math, but I would be able to revisit that budget and provide you with that information.
Get back to Trevor, our budget person. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are now,
One question.
okay, I'm sorry.
Just to follow up and along my same vein of thought, Tapestry has a surplus also. They have a surplus. And it says that their funds will be returned to the HHS levy. Will it go back to the levy, or will it pass through the PA account, or does it come back? And maybe that's for Rubino again.
I think we need Matt again.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman and the council member, we would just not need to subsidize them at the projected level. From the beginning of the year, we anticipated a certain level of subsidization from the levy fund to Tapestry's budget. In this case, since they are going to spend less projected, we will request less levy dollars to be transferred at the end of this year.
So where will those dollars go?
They won't go over, they will not be moved from the levy to the funding source for Tapestry. We'll transfer less than anticipated.
Oh,
So they'll remain in the levy fund.
They never received the money.
They won't need the dollars. We'll determine the level of subsidy based on the needs. So at the end of the year, projected expense combined with the other sources of revenue from state and federal sources, that determines the projected local match from the levy. And it's the dollars we request to be transferred over at the end of the year. In fact, I think on the November 22nd council meeting, our biweekly fiscal agenda will have the year-end transfers from the levy fund to the operating budgets of Health and Human Services. We'll make, for the most part, make most of our requests for year-end transfer of levy dollars based on our anticipated projected expenses and revenue for the year. So if we need less, we won't transfer as much as originally anticipated when we adopted the 2011 operating plan.
Okay, thank you.
For the purposes of the director's planning, the council is not meeting on November 22nd.
Whatever that November date is, is there a middle of November date?
We're meeting on November 9th and then not again to December 6th.
That would be the date in December 6th.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Director.
Thank you very much, Council.
We are momentarily going to take a very short break. I think we need it. We have 4 very big things on the morning agenda, and unless Employment and Family Services goes much faster, I anticipate that we'll do Employment and Family Services and then have our lunch break and then continue with Senior and Adult Services to start the afternoon session. We will come back at 11:15, so it's going to be a very short break. Just stretch and check whatever else you need to and get right back. Thank you.